I'm Curtis Knight, Executive Director of California Trout, and your host of the Freshwater People podcast. Joining us today is Dr. Sandra Jacobson, CalTrout's South Coast and Sierra Headwaters Regional Director. In the High Sierra, Sandy and her team works on meadow restoration and fuels reduction projects, and closer to her home base of San Diego, she manages the South Coast Steelhead Coalition and helps implement the National Marine Fisheries Service Southern California Steelhead Recovery Plan. Which brings us to today's topic, a very exciting and very recent unanimous vote to list the southern steelhead as endangered under the California Endangered Species Act. It's a huge win for these fish, and it takes people like Sandy working hard every day to make it happen. So let's get into it and learn more about Southern California's waterways, fish passes barriers, conditions that led to this new listing, and what the listing means for southern steelhead. Sandy, welcome to the Freshwater People podcast.
Great to be here, Curtis.
We're here talking about timely and recent events, of big news that happened just a couple weeks ago, and that is the state listing under the California Endangered Species Act of southern steelhead. It's a big deal. You and your team have been working on this for years, including with our policy team, and we really wanted to get you on today to kind of better explain what's this news mean, what's it mean for our work, how big a deal is it?
This is a big win. The southern steelhead have been endangered under a federal listing for 25 years now. And even though some really great work has happened across the landscape from San Diego all the way up to Santa Barbara and beyond, the abundance, the number of steelhead are still so low, and the trend is going down towards extinction. So now's the time to really, you round everything up together, get the state listing completed. And CalTrout led it starting in 2021. And it was tremendous to see the Fish and Game Commission come forward and unanimously approve the state listing for southern steelhead. One of the things that I ended with at the Fish and Game Commission was that picture of that big silver fish in the Santa Ynez.
Yeah.
And the question is, when is the picture of one steelhead the picture of the last steelhead? That's when you know that you need a state listing to augment the federal listing.
Okay, so that's a huge accomplishment, but we've also recognized that, boy, there's a sad part of that too, that they have to be listed because, as you're saying, the downward trends continue. Maybe we should take a quick step back. I think most people understand what a steelhead is, but maybe you should cover that real quick and then describe, this idea of a southern steelhead, what makes them unique sort of from the genetic standpoint and also distribution, all those sorts of things.
Steelhead are the ocean-going form of rainbow trout, essentially. So they migrate between the ocean and freshwater where they spawn and rear for years. And then some proportion of them express what's called like an anadromy phenotype or behavior that causes them to go back out to the ocean. It's a very complex trait genetically. We know some of what controls that, but not all. It's a combination of genetics and environment, which makes it tricky to understand exactly what the triggers are. So southern steelhead are relatively unique along the California landscape in that these are the fish that have adapted to a more Mediterranean climate. The water is warmer. They are more thermotolerant. They are more opportunistic. When they move from one watershed to another, they don't necessarily go back to their natal stream. And that's because in Southern California, many of our rivers are bar-built estuaries, meaning that there is a big load of sand that's really important for erosion control and property protection. But there's a big load of sand there that only bursts under really high rainstorms and flow that comes through, and it can push out 5 to 10 feet of sand there. That's the signal for these fish to come back into the river. Then they know that they have enough flow to make it from the ocean all the way to the mountains.
So describe these creatures. I mean, a lot of people have probably caught steelhead, Northern California, maybe in BC or Oregon or Alaska or whatever. These are the same things, right? These are these big silvery fish, these big, beautiful fish that are going into these heavily urbanized areas.
Yeah. The fish themselves are pretty remarkable when you think just about their resiliency to all sorts of threats, and they still come out swimming. So when they're rainbow, they have that really characteristic, nice kind of reddish hue. But as they smolt, that's the name for it, is when they transition into an ocean-going form of the species, they turn silver, they elongate, their gill structure changes a bit. And also internally, from a biological point of view, they actually change their gene expression so that they can tolerate the difference between a saline, a very salty environment, and a freshwater environment. And if you think about that, it's really a remarkable thing for an organism to do. Not that many critters can do that. But as they move between the ocean and the freshwater, this might be 30 miles inland in the mountains. So they're making a dash in these flashy rivers that have a hydrograph that looks like, a bell curve. So they basically have 72 hours or so to make it from the ocean inland as they move during these really intense rainstorms.
That's amazing. And so then these fish enter these streams ready to go. The flows, the rains are coming, the water's there, but there's impediments down there. And that's really a big focus of your work, is removing barriers so these fish can get up into their habitats, right?
That's right. Every hour counts in getting a fish from the ocean up into the headwaters. And some of the barriers are very tall, and they're total barriers. They might be bridges, they might be dams like Ringe or Matilaha. And it's very complicated to take them out because there's many people and many entities that are involved in regulating that. And so the barriers coming out are big. CalTrout has a Dams Out initiative that extends all the way across the state. And we have a couple major barriers that we're working on down in Southern California.
Yeah, I mean, several big barriers, but also some of these barriers that, I wouldn't say they're small, but I think you've been pushing a lot on the Santa Margarita River. It's a big transportation corridor, total fish barrier, and you're hopefully starting to implement the removal of that barrier, the replacement of a bridge, just an example of the kind of big scale project work that you're doing. And talk about the significance of removing that barrier on the Santa Margarita River.
Yeah, it reconnects the watershed. There were two barriers in the main stem of the river that are now very close to just being out. So the lower part of the river is in Camp Pendleton, and they remediated their barrier in several years ago. And now CalTrout is working on the last barrier to steelhead migration in this perennial river in Southern California. So it'll basically open up an additional 12 miles to the headwaters. And overall, it reconnects 29 miles of river. It started out as a fish passage project, but because that structure overtopped, it was a flood danger. It's the #1 flooding hotspot in San Diego County. It's in the middle of a wildlands preserve, and it's a wildlife corridor. It just brings the community together because there are so many benefits once you start working on removing and remediating aging infrastructure. It's all good.
What always struck me, getting to know Southern California rivers better, because I'm definitely a Northern California person, but spending more time down there, especially with you and looking at some of these places, it's remarkable how there are these pockets of really good habitat left. Right by Dana Point, San Juan Capistrano, all that area, heavily urbanized. But the actual creek above this barrier is waiting for the steelhead. It's in good shape.
Right. You go all the way up. There's a mixture of urban development, but there's huge tracts of open space and parks. And once you get into the Santa Ana Mountains, you have Majeska Peak, Santiago Peak. These are big peaks, and it is a really good trout habitat up there. These are rainbow trouts. These are the trout they're the remnant populations of steelhead runs from like 100 years ago. We know this from genetic analysis, where they are, about how many there are, but these are all behind barriers. These guys are susceptible to fires and drought. And so the more populations we have, the more genetic diversity, the more geographic diversity we have of these progenitor strains, the better off we are.
This gets tricky and this gets complex about the steelhead that are down below these barriers and the rainbow trout that are up above. So try to sort that out for us.
So below a barrier, the Omicus, that species, the trout can move to the ocean and back. But typically in the lower part of a watershed where the first total barrier is, it's not great habitat. These are more migratory pathways. And so once you take a barrier out, then the steelhead can go all the way up to the headwaters, and that's where the good habitat is. Another important point to distinguish very few trout below the first barrier, perhaps many more trout above the first barrier up in the mountains, but only a few of those can come out and go into the ocean and start that anatomy cycle.
Right. So just underscoring that importance of removing those barriers to allow those populations to increase their genetic diversity, increase the population. And that really, I mean, that's one of the primary steps. I mean, this listing of southern steelhead under the California Endangered Species Act is really meant to increasingly incentivize these types of actions of removing barriers, priority
Right.
number one.
And we try to work with as many partners as we can to help them, get the grant funding in place, try to understand the engineering that goes into that. And really that for the fish themselves, it's the state listing is a huge benefit. But also, if you look at the issues where there are barriers, it's usually aging infrastructure. And so when you have the CESA listing, the benefit is it modernizes your infrastructure, both for water and transportation. It helps to streamline compliance with the Endangered Species Act and kind of not let these projects stay in limbo for a while, but to actually move them through to construction. This is really important because they're complex projects.
You're listening to the Fishwater People podcast, proudly presented by California Trout, a nonprofit organization founded over 50 years ago. What started as a commitment to resilient wild fish has grown into a broader mission supported by our four-pillared approach to conservation: science, restoration, community engagement, and advocacy. We love the work we do, and we couldn't do it without our supporters, so we want to hear from you. Why do you support CalTrout? What makes California's rivers special to you? Let us know. To have your answer featured on the show, just record a voice memo and email to podcast@caltrout.org. That's podcast@caltrout.org. And we're back with Sandy Jacobson. Maybe we could talk about Ringe Dam, that Malibu Creek watershed, the partnerships involved there, Ringe Dam's history. I mean, it's a really fascinating story.
It is. For those that know Malibu Canyon, it's just beautiful. And 3 miles in, the Ringe family built Ringe Dam. And it's a 100-foot high concrete structure with it's a dam and a spillway. And it was originally built, so it was like 1924. And it was built for, local and private water supply. But within 20 years, the thing had completely filled with sediment. And so that was in the 40s. And then in the 60s, it was decommissioned. And it's part of the state parks now. So California State Parks is the lead on this project. And it's been several decades in the making. It was federally designated for the Army Corps to go through the alternatives analysis and do the scientific underpinnings of how we're going to take this dam down. But now with some additional funding from the state, and the EIR through public comment and approval, here we are. And a technical team has been hired to move that forward into 90% design for deconstruction of the dam.
That's so exciting. I mean, we know how hard big dam removal is, and it's a pretty big dam in a small little canyon. It's always fascinating to me, too, when you think about Malibu Creek and Steelhead. Malibu, surfing in the ocean and movie stars and all these things, whatever comes to mind, but steelhead don't come to mind.
So one of the main differences between Northern California, where people expect to see steelhead, coho, an abundance of salmon running in the rivers, and down south here, is that the rivers are just they're ephemeral. So they don't run all the time necessarily, but there's really good habitat up in the mountains. And so these are spring fed, and that's where the rainbow trout are more abundant. But as they come out, and for those trout that are out in the ocean, those are steelhead, and they are more thermotolerant. They are more resourceful as far as getting into new rivers and trying to make it upstream. So it's a very simple equation of taking out barriers, opening up the estuaries, and improving the habitat upstream in the mountains so that they can spawn and rear. There's only so many components, that are really essential for steelhead to survive. But it's very different down here than in Northern California, where they kind of have a free reign of running all the way up well inland into the good habitat. So one of the things that they encounter here are invasive species. So because, the water is warmer, the air temperature is warmer, and there are pools that there are bass, crayfish, bullhead, and it's really hard for steelhead to compete with that. So CalTrout and Nate Yanchup is working on this in the San Diego office, is working with the Regional Water Board to implement a new it's called a TMDL, a total maximum daily load. It's a water quality parameter that will reduce the number of invasives, aquatic invasive species, and bolster steelhead populations. So it's a whole new approach, and we're really excited about doing that.
Yeah, it's remarkable to think about steelhead spawning in bass water, but it really speaks to, like you're saying, their thermal tolerance. And you hear some people say that, like, this is the fish of the future as California's climate changes and maybe prolonged droughts here or there. The genetics that these southern steelhead have to allow them to persist in these harsh conditions going to be really important in the future, right?
It is. As the water temperature rises, as we go further north along the coast in California, those that are adapted to warmer water, that's going to be key for the genetics. Yeah.
That's incredible. Well, that's a great example too of just another hurdle that they have. I think about the Eel River. Certainly pike minnow is something we focus a lot on, and the Eel River as an invasive species having a really big impact there. A lot of work going on there that we talked about a little bit in a previous podcast, but down there, yeah, just you think about a young steelhead fry, an inch long, dropping into a pool full of, like you said, bullhead and frog tadpoles even, and bass and everything else. I mean, what are the chances?
Yeah. And also, as you take out even smaller barriers, the ability for native aquatic species to move around is really important. So Cleveland National Forest, they took out 80 check dams in upper Trabuco and San Juan Creek in Orange County, and they just pretty much completed that a couple years ago. That's a huge job. But now they've seen the arroyo chub and some of these native species immediately move into new habitat. And so it's just really important under conditions of drought, so they can move around a bit, and then also fire on the landscape, that they have an escape route, essentially.
Oh, I see. Yeah. But that's the idea here. I mean, this idea of returning steelhead to Malibu Creek, they're there right now, right? They're moving in there and bumping up against this dam. Maybe not a lot of them, but they're there right now.
They have the ability to come in, and that's really what it takes. So it might just be one or two. In fact, over the last 25 years, only 177 adult steelhead, returning steelhead, have been documented from San Diego all the way up to Santa Barbara and Santa Maria River. So they're very few, but they're there, and they come in, and they need to get all the way up to complete their life cycle.
I know you and I joke about them being unicorns, and that's almost true. It gets the idea across, except they do exist. Sandy, you mentioned some pictures that you saw, some documentation of just this year in some of the creeks down there that people saw adult steelhead moving around.
Yeah, there's some big steelhead moving through, indeed. It's over 24 inches, bright silver. In some of the bigger rivers like Santa Clara, and also one of the tribs to the Santa Ynez. But when we come back and you look at Ringe Dam, that with that dam being in place, that altered the hydrology, the overall ecology of that watershed. So the sediment couldn't transport down for beach nourishment, into erosion control for the property down there. So we're just really working through the alternatives to minimize any sort of water elevation gain, or really direct it down to maximize the benefits of taking out that dam.
Yeah, you bring up a great point sort of about the multiple benefits of dam removal, and our lens on it tends to be steelhead and getting them up into the upper watershed, making them more resilient, more abundant. But there's also an aspect of this that if you do that a lot of other good things happen too. Maybe talk a little bit more about, sediment's always such a huge thing. What do you do with the sediment that's there? What has the disruption of that sediment moving down through the system done to the entire river? And as you're describing sort of the estuary and the beach, maybe talk about that sort of from a holistic standpoint there a little bit more.
It is. I think, just look at the Klamath and other instances where it's a watershed scale approach to solving problems that dams have presented to us. And these are, kind of derelict dams that do not serve a function anymore. And so taking them out just makes a lot of sense from an ecological and a species point of view. When the dams are there, it just blocks the normal sediment transport. It's a very underappreciated process within a river, that as the sediment comes down, it brings it down into the estuary, into the lagoon. It nourishes the beach. It provides a buffer against erosion of waves coming up. And typically, the beaches and the property there are highly valued by the community itself. So, I don't know if people can get their head around this, but Ringe itself has about 275,000 cubic yards of sediment behind it. And so part of the expense and the solution is knowing exactly how to treat that sediment, how to, what can go into the beach, what needs to go elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Right. I always thought it was interesting that Surfrider Foundation is one of our big partners. They're really, especially on Matilaha Dam on the Ventura River, and you're thinking, what's a surfing organization so focused on dam removal for? But just as you're saying, the beach replenishment, that how that interacts with the near shore environment and making waves and things like that. It's so it just strings out into everything.
Yeah. And that's something that I hope that we really get into in the future as well, is understanding that near shore environment. We know very little about where steelhead go when they go out into the ocean. Sometimes they might go next door. Sometimes they might go for a swim, quite a distance a ways. But what we do know is that a naturally functioning ecosystem is absolutely critical for multiple species to exist. That, as a steelhead goes, if it's not trapped and just becoming very genetically singular, just because there is no outside influence, when that steelhead can go out or other species can go out and create genetic diversity, that is the backbone of resiliency.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of people, when they think about southern steelhead, they're just like, oh, really? Are we really going to do that? You got to build up hope for this thing. And I think you and your team's work down there, for me, has really built up that hope. And I think maybe you can describe a little bit about abundance there and what we're looking for, and what are some achievable goals. And maybe, I know that document you all provided for the state listing had a lot of good historical information in there. And yeah, some of it's 40, 50 years old, but some of it's just 40, 50 years old, where there were some good numbers of southern steelhead still returning down to those rivers. So maybe talk about some of the not too recent past, where what was this abundance like? What can we expect to see in the future?
So it'll be a slow climb out, but really it depends on opening up the rivers, creating habitat, and just creating those opportunities. And the fish know what to do. So even though there are very few now, there were tens of thousands before. And so as we remediate these threats and steelhead can return and have that abundance, we have a very modest goal of just reestablishing 2 anadromous populations in our priority rivers down south here. And so that's just in the San Diego, Orange County area. And one would expect that that's entirely possible up kind of in the central, like in Santa Clara, Ventura rivers, once Ringe is out, and then going all the way up into Santa Ynez is one of the strongholds for steelhead, both that and the Maria, as well as the shorter but very effective Santa Barbara coastal streams. There's a lot of small ones, and they can really support productive reproduction there as well.
And I know the Santa Clara River, right there, Ventura, we have a Ventura office. We talk a lot about the Matilaha Dam there and the Ventura River. but just south of there is the Santa Clara River, big watershed, and especially some of those tributaries, Santa Paula Creek, Sespe Creek, draining a lot of great wilderness habitat area. Maybe talk a little bit about our work in the Santa Clara River and what we could see there from an abundance standpoint in the future.
Right. Yeah, I definitely want to give a shout out to our team in the South Coast and in the Sierra. But coastally, when we talk about Steelhead, Russell Marlowe runs the office out of the Ventura area. And Judy and Elizabeth, they are our chief public engagement and coalition managers, respectively. So CalTrout has led 2 coalitions for a number of years now, Steelhead coalitions that bring together entities with different missions, but to have a common purpose for healthy watersheds and healthy fisheries. And so the Ventura office is great there. Russell has led 2 of the major fish passage and ecosystem level restoration projects there in Santa Paula Creek, as you mentioned. That's the Harvey diversion, which was an irrigation diversion, now more of a small dam. And then also the Rose Valley, that project is really excellent for kind of a combination of ecosystem restoration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's exciting. I think you can start to see it down there. You can start to see how resilient these fish are just in the fact that they're still there, and that you take away, what is it? A handful of barriers down there, and all of a sudden you start to give them a chance. You're starting to give them a chance in the habitat that more or less still exists and is still functioning and still has the ability to produce steelhead. It's pretty exciting to see where this could go in the next, 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, I think that's the time frame, that 5 to 10 years we'll have most of the big barriers out and the steelhead have a chance to return. The rainbow trout in the uplands are waiting to have some new blood in there.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, there we go. It's a mini Alaska. We have steelhead fishing lodges showing up on Malibu Creek and people spay fishing for them on the Santa Clara. It's going to be crazy.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
When I see those pictures back in the day, like in the 1940s, it was not that long ago, that there were some big fish, and there were people out in the estuaries and they love fishing for steelhead.
Oh man, I know. You had some of those in the report where stringers of huge steelhead, and like you're saying, it was not that long ago. And so you feel like the opportunity to get back to 25% of that, 50% of that, you could do that. It could be had.
Yeah. It's persistence, actually. So it's careful planning and persistence and partnerships. It's always the teamwork that makes it go. Because they're big projects, they take a little bit longer than most people, can foresee. But the idea is to get the designs done and in the ground.
Yeah. Well, that's amazing. Well, Sandy, I know I speak for all of our staff and so many of the CalTrouters out there, but you and your team are so inspiring down there, working on the unicorns, the southern steelhead down there, and really providing hope to something that a lot of people, I think, see as a big challenge. But when I see the work that you're doing, I get really excited about what's to come. So thank you for all you do down there.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. I just see it as feasible. It takes persistence.
Yep. Persistence. Well, I know you have that. I know you have persistence. That's for sure.
The whole team does. Yeah.
The whole team. Well, thank you again, Sandy, for joining the Fishwater People podcast.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We're celebrating southern steelhead added to the California Endangered Species Act, and we wanted to hear from someone who knows the ins and outs of the legal side of the process, so we called up Redgie Collins, CalTrout's Legal and Policy Director. Redgie, welcome to the Fishwater People podcast.
It's good to be here. Thanks for having me, Curtis.
Yeah, well, it's timely too, because we've been talking to Sandy about southern steelhead and what this means for them, but we want to get some perspective from you and how you and your team approach this. I mean, the process and what it takes to actually get a species listed. What does that whole process look like?
Yeah, it's a testament to the awesome work by Sandy and her shop down in Southern California, first and foremost. It's a highly scientific and specific endeavor that requires you to meet a series of very specific elements to actually submit a petition to list those species. And luckily, CalTrout has the scientific information in-house. So the first piece of it was in July of 2021, after, a year or so of intense research and writing to meet those petition standards. CalTrout submitted that petition. So that was really the first step in this saga.
So we submit a petition to the California Fish and Game Commission in 2021. And then what happened over the course of the next year?
A lot of our work, and especially a lot of my work in the legal and policy realm, we're lucky if we get anything done in a year. And so, this was a long process. So in April 2022, the California Fish and Game Commission unanimously voted that the state ESA listing of southern steelhead, quote unquote, may be warranted, meaning that kicks off another year-long review by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. We were crossing our fingers and hoping that the California Department of Fish and Wildlife viewed that petition as warranted.
Right. So then it really is getting down to like the biology and what do we know about these fish, the status and those sorts of things, and sort of this review by the department. While that's happening, we get challenged, right? There's a challenge to that listing and that listing process. Talk about what happened in the fall of 2023.
Absolutely. I mean, as you can imagine, any new listing of species, under California, under state law or under federal law, triggers additional protections. And you can imagine that folks are concerned about that impact. So in October, as we were awaiting the review of the actual petition by CDFW, we had a little bump along the path, and that came in the way of litigation. We had the United Water Conservation District actually bring suit against our petition in order to slow down the process, to prove that we didn't do a good enough job on our scientific analysis in that petition. And some of the arguments included this species listing isn't accurate for historical range. We had a couple arguments associated with, resident rainbow trout versus southern steelhead. And throughout that process, it really honed our ability to understand just how rigorous, the work done by Sandy and others was. And so we were really able to stand firmly on that backing and really understand what some of the concerns from opposition were. So while it's not ideal that we get challenged in court, definitely a positive, and we were thrilled to win that case in October.
Right. Yeah, that's a good sort of behind the scenes on what it takes to keep these things moving. Legal challenges. So we swat away that legal challenge. That's awesome. And then in January of 2024, the Department of Fish and Wildlife been working hard. What are they doing? They're submitting a status report, right?
Right. Yeah, they can't just take our word for it perfectly. And, it may seem like a long period of time, a year, to review CalTrout's petition, but that just goes to show how serious this is. I mean, it has statewide implications, or at least implications for the historic boundaries of southern steelhead. And the California Department of Fish and Wildlife took that full year, and their conclusion was that our petition warranted that coverage under the California Endangered Species Act. So in January 2024, we heard that decision, but the next step was equally important, getting that final sign-off by the California Fish and Game Commission themselves.
Right. So that was a big step in January. So just the beginning of this year, all the data said, yes, we do think it's warranted. Now the Department of Fish and Wildlife is behind it. Now it goes to the Fish and Game Commission. And so leading up to this, we had a couple months to prepare for the Fish and Game Commission meeting in April. And what do? We kind of had a grassroots movement there to get people to show their support.
Absolutely. There's the policy piece. We got to garner that support from the general public to show that southern steelhead listing was warranted. When you look at that decision by California Fish and Game Commission, it's somewhat of a political vote here. And so we want to make sure that we have all of the scientific basis covered, which we, of course, do in-house. And then we want to make sure that we have the showing of support by the general public that this listing is warranted. And we were able to gather about 7,000 signatures supporting that southern steelhead listing. We also followed up and made sure that all the legislators in Southern California knew how important of the decision this was. Through January through April 2024, we made sure we had that really concerted policy effort to make sure that Fish and Game Commission knew that they had many Californians as possible behind this decision.
So then in April 18th, the Fish and Game Commission meets and gets to hear from the public. I watched this. Maybe talk a little bit about what some of the opposition was. What are some of the points that they were making in saying, hey, we don't like this listing because why?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, in principle, I don't think anyone would say that we don't want southern steelhead, to be protected and to be revived as a species. I think that really is never the argument that you hear, at least not, as clearly. But what you see here as far as, opposition is the concerns about water management in Southern California. We all know how important it is to have infrastructure that creates safe, and affordable drinking water for all of California. And then in the same lens, making sure that we have affordable water for agriculture in Southern California. And a lot of folks don't know this, but Southern California and the Steelhead Range, is a really super vibrant agricultural community. And so those water operators want to make sure that the new CISA listings, don't make the cost of doing business so high that they can't continue to, feed the rest of California and provide clean drinking water. And so part of our job, was to describe exactly the changes you'd see and kind of assuage concerns associated with, stifling that economic activity. And so those are the biggest pushbacks we saw, against the southern steelhead listing.
Right. And I saw some of those folks spoke up at the hearing. But through all that, the Fish and Game Commission on that day, April 18th, voted unanimously to list, right? I mean, that's pretty remarkable, right? An unanimous vote.
It is. I mean, I think that the science has really shone through. I think Sandy did an excellent job describing exactly, what the benefits were. It actually will help modernize infrastructures throughout Southern California. It'll allow us to have water and transportation infrastructure that meets the 21st century fish passage and water supply, technologies. It'll push water users to actually, meet those heightened standards, but it'll allow for that return of steelhead, we're hoping, and a number of other benefits, including, streamlining the compliance with Endangered Species Act, that double California and federal protections will allow that state permitting process to be a little smoother, we think. We think there's a huge benefit to disadvantaged communities and environmental justice communities, increasing that access to clean water and providing that fish passage. And, the biggest thing we see is that, historic cultural significance of return of species. I think that this is a really exciting time for California. And I think that the Fish and Game Commission as a whole, saw these benefits as outweighing the negatives. We think it's a really important decision, and we don't take it lightly that it was unanimous. I think there's a lot of good work by a lot of smart people in CalTrout and a lot of our community as well.
Absolutely. And I think the Department of Fish and Wildlife too deserves a big shout out. Their staff did a great job in this review and providing a lot of that science information as well. Maybe just talk a little bit about, you touched on this, but the idea of these fish were already listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act. Now we add this California Endangered Species Act listing. How do they complement each other? What's the added benefit of having a state listing on top of a federal listing?
It's a great question. The fact that they're listed directly as endangered under the California Endangered Species Act gives them a heightened support and we've written into recovery plans throughout the state. And so what that means is, they really have to pay attention to it by law and figure out ways in which we can try to recover these species. And so that may seem like a small step, but it really mandates these government agencies to take a closer look at southern steelhead. There's also incidental take permits, which gets a little bit in the weeds here, but it really requires anyone who may affect southern steelhead due to changing operations of their water projects. Think of a water conveyance project in Southern California that wants to add additional capacity to retention ponds. Say they want to spill water, onto the ground to keep it in storage long term, which benefits everyone. But if you're not screening that, if you're not paying attention to the specific life cycle of southern steelhead, you could be harming these endangered species. And so it requires that additional oversight. It also allows us to implement the coastal monitoring program for southern steelhead for the southern area, which will allow us to better understand the movement of these species long term. And so it's the highlighting of this important species as a big step forward, the protection. But then you do have these specific elements that'll really, we think, help recover these species long term.
Right. It helps bring resources, attention, incentives. I mean, we talked about this with Sandy. I mean, it helps to incentivize some of these big pushes that we need to do to get this trend of southern steelhead numbers heading in the right direction. We talked about Matilaha Dam and Ringe Dam in particular. Those are two big projects that have long been talked about. Momentum's building to remove both those big structures. Something like this can really help push that along even faster.
As we look at our work, I think one thing that really impresses me about CalTrout is that, when we're looking at a problem, we strategically, take every tool out and see what's going to work. And so I think that for this element, for the recovery of southern steelhead, the legal and policy nexus, that scientific understanding, I think it all came together with a really incredibly positive decision.
And that's a great rundown, what it takes to get a species listed under the California Endangered Species Act. So thanks for taking us behind the scenes there. And thank you to you and your team for helping push that along.
Yep, it's a pleasure to be part of the team. It feels incredible to get that done, and especially with an iconic species like southern steelhead.
Thanks so much to Dr. Sandy Jacobson and Redgie Collins for joining the Fishwater People podcast. And as always, thanks to Wilco for the theme music. I'm Curtis Knight, Executive Director of CalTrout and your host of the Fishwater People podcast. This episode was written, produced, and engineered by Bridget Shaw and Drew Alvarez of Pusher Media on the banks of the Sacramento River in the historic train town and trout town of Dunsmuir, California.